Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined again by crowd favorite Parker Thompson, returning back to the podcast, and then new guest Antonio Garcia Martinez, author of Chaos Monkeys, and a lot more to come. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So Antonio, you wrote Chaos Monkeys, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
It came out in 2016, so not quite 2 years ago. Yeah.
And it was,
more than 2 years
to me
ago.
as a reader, it read sort of half Hunter S. Thompson, half Michael Lewis, Silicon Valley.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was aiming for. Yes, thank you.
So it's sort of your personal story. I would say first half of the book, going, starting a company, going through YC, you say, call out people, who's great, who's not, what that journey is like to sell a company, to raise money from investors. And then the second half is your time at Facebook, how Facebook ads work. If you were writing that book today, how would that be different?
I don't think it would be too different. The first half would definitely be about the same. I mean, it's very much a typical story. Go through YC, start a horrible company, not knowing what the hell you're doing, and then manage to somehow spring the golden parachute and have a dinky little acqui-hire that I managed to make way more dramatic than it needed to be in retrospect. So the first half I don't think would have changed. The second half with Facebook I think would have changed. In my very immodest, presumptuous first-time author way, the same conversation we're having now about Facebook, I thought the book would at least trigger or stoke, right? But obviously it took a bomb the size of Trump to actually make that conversation happen. So I think in retrospect, a lot about how Facebook monetizes would stay exactly the same because I think that really hasn't changed. However, I think I would have talked more about the bigger picture of organic news distribution and the political impact of that and the whole that I get more into.
Yeah, let's get into it. So that's potentially what your next book is going to be about.
A little bit. I don't want to be that guy who's constantly talking about Facebook. I'm already bored by it, actually. But there's actually very few people w'ho've been there who are willing to talk on the record. I think it's basically me and Stamos at this point. And so it's like we get trotted out whenever there's like someone from the former Insight say something. So I don't want to talk about Facebook. And in fact, I only use the term Facebook as shorthand for like this smart, like everyone becoming a cyborg and melding our brains to a phone, like whatever you want to call that. We can call it Facebook if you want, but I think the particulars of Mark Zuckerberg's creation, I think, are actually less important than that sort of epical event in terms of the bigger scheme of things. With that as the understanding of Facebook, it is about Facebook in terms of, I think, the bigger impact that has on everything, all the cultural institutions that we were raised in. I think one of the interesting things about people my age and maybe Parker's age as well, because you look to be about my age, is that, we're that bridge, I guess sort of Gen X-y bridge generation that were raised fundamentally in an analog world. My mother was a librarian, right? Like to me, there was this meme about like, what's the thing you could tell millennials that would like most shock them? And I think the thing that I tweeted about that was like, back in the day, the only way to know about a thing was to find either a book that talked about the thing or someone who knew about the thing. Otherwise, you just didn't know about the thing. There was no way to know, right? And books were still, relatively rare and expensive, right? There was a reference desk at libraries because most families couldn't own all those books. And you had to go through a set of drawers like the size of like an SUV, if not bigger, and go through little cards and try to find the book. And half the time you wouldn't find it, right? And you just didn't know about that thing. There was whole lacunas of knowledge about the world that you just didn't know. If it wasn't an entry inside World Book, it basically didn't exist to you, right? And so I think going from that world to the world where we are now, where literally what's in this little thing I'm waving for radio, I'm waving the phone in my hand, contains more than I ever would have imagined as a child, right? Like we are the generation that spans that. I think it's a huge transformation. I think it changes a lot about the world. And what I fundamentally want to write about is how we go from that Gutenberg paradigm of like the written word, like literally written on dead trees as the repository of human knowledge, to this new, weird, fragmented, ephemeral media landscape that I think in many ways is taking us forward to the past. In other words, it makes us more tribal. It's kind of like oral cultures. It's very different than sitting down and reading an 8,000 word New Yorker piece, right? Which I frankly doubt many people actually do anymore. So that's kind of what the book's about.
And you've been studying Marshall McLuhan and other media theorists, or restudying.
I was one of these people that spent too long in grad school. So I have this like academic bee in my bonnet that insists on going and reading as much as I can tolerate about a certain topic. And so I went back and read most of the big media theorists from like Walter Lippmann and whenever it was 30s and 40s up until like Neil Postman in the 80s and 90s to get a feel for what they were thinking about. And what was shocking to me is how much they got right. In fact, I was just reading, McLuhan has an amazing, if you just want like the short version of McLuhan, go read the 9 or 10 page interview he did in Playboy in 1969. That is probably the most succinct distillation of his thought that you can get at. And he could have written that yesterday. Like literally a word would not need to be changed to update that for the modern era. Right?
And what was his punchline?
Well, the idea is much of what I already said, right? Like he saw new electronic media. His classic masterpiece is called Understanding Media or The Extensions of Man or whatever, right? He saw this new media as literally extending the sensory system of man in a way that it wasn't before, right? In other words, you suddenly have eyes. Your eyes are suddenly the smartphone that everyone carries around them in the sense that you can, in effect, be there via live stream, which, again, if you think about it, it was not long ago that to get like real-time streaming video, you need to have like a van with a big ass antenna and a camera operator, engineer inside. Like it was expensive. There's no way you could do that, right? And suddenly now man's sensory organs have extended in that sense all over the world. And I think what that does, his whole medium is the message thing, which is like a cliche that everyone pretends to understand. I did too, before I actually tried getting through his book. And then I finally actually understood what it means. It's not about the content of the message. What you're looking at isn't necessarily even that important. It's how the medium reshapes your thinking about the thing that really matters. Not to like immediately trip over the third rail here, but like the Kavanaugh hearing, for example, right. Or the thing with the Catholic kids and the Nathan Phillips, right? Like it's not even so much the content of that. It's how it was presented and digested and parsed and distributed and reacted to that really mattered, right? Like you could literally switch out almost every character in that drama. So long as the basics were the same, you would have ended up with the same sort of fiasco, right? And so that's what McLuhan means when the media is the message. That reading a textual description of that in the Wall Street Journal in 1984 is a very different experience than going and reading the 10-second clip on video on Twitter with 100 of your friends commenting on it, right? Like that's what he means by the medium. Like that medium change completely, like the message is almost irrelevant. It's how the medium actually shapes that shapes your reaction to it.
And so how do we use these new mediums to become less tribal or less polarized?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's impossible. I think we're headed straight back to, I mean, from the media perspective, I think we're headed back to like almost the media landscape that existed during the time of the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers, right? Ben Franklin wrote under 14 different pseudonyms during his time. He would have been like you, Parker Thompson.
Federalist Papers, yeah.
Yes. Starville Jackson. Yeah.
Right. Right, exactly. Federalist Papers would have been like Neon Taster or whatever, whoever the hell he is, or Comfortably Smug or whatever on Twitter. Like that's exactly who they were. That's exactly who they were. Like those saying, oh no, things were better in the past. Like, no, are you kidding? Go back and read some of the stuff they wrote. It was nastier than now. I mean, the whole duel between Alexander Hamilton and Burr was over something they had written.
Well, but it's not linear, right? There are times that when it was better and times that it was worse. I mean, I guess I tend to think we're in a transition period. It's not obvious if the future is going to be better or worse. So like, I look at this as like the Facebooks of the world are the dog that caught the car, right? You invent the feed. You're like, what's the classic Zuckerberg quote? It's like, I'm just trying to make a website for college kids, right? I think that's right. And if that's all you want to do, and then you make the feed and you get all the users, I mean, the feed is the thing that matters, right? Like the feed is the medium across all these things, right? The feed is one. We all use it. It shapes the way we think. It shapes our discourse. You see your friends clustering around that thing, or you don't, depending on the person who designed the feed. And I think where we're at, personally, we are in an era where the people aggregating the users and deciding what we see, the gatekeepers, right? Because the internet, we used to think the internet was this gatekeeper-free thing. It turns out that was a temporary period, right? And it's consolidated, as we've seen in media generations past. In the past, we had eras of responsibility and responsible gatekeepers, right? Let's say the newspapers in the last generation. And now we're in a period where the gatekeepers, the feed makers, actually want to pretend that they don't have any responsibility, right? Like they don't decide which 80% of messages you don't see, right? But they do. So the question in my mind going forward is, okay, will these new gatekeepers evolve into, I would characterize it maybe as more responsible. You might look at it a different way, right? I think people are really afraid of that idea. They don't want to come to grips with the idea that there are going to be gatekeepers. We'd all prefer that there weren't, but there are. And the question is whether they're going to be good or bad. I think by analogy, to tie it back to tech, I mean, there's this great Peter Thiel sort of line of thinking around he likes to be contrarian, the virtues of monopoly, right? Or empire. He talks about empires, right?
Of course he would, but yeah.
Right? Yeah, of course he would. Well, no, there's some validity to the thinking, right? in times of empire, you get what you might call positive externalities, right? So maybe in the Mongol Empire, that was the Silk Road and increased trade and wealth across Asia and into Europe. In the newspaper era, maybe that was high quality journalism, right? So the question going forward is, will these monopolies that exist, and you could argue degree, but certainly these new media aggregators are to some degree monopolies. Will they become virtuous monopolies? Will they become virtuous empires? Or will it all go to shit?
No, I agree with most of that. I mean, certainly there's definitely positive. The first one that came to mind was actually AT&T and Bell Labs. In my case, as a former physics guy, right? The transistor was invented at Bell Labs, and they actually had a number of Nobel Prizes. I mean, the thought of Google or Facebook winning a Nobel Prize now seems a little, you can't quite imagine. I guess Google maybe. I would like to push back slightly on that though, just because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Take WhatsApp, for example, which I've become a big user of recently, even though I haven't been historically. WhatsApp to me is like a perfect product foil for Facebook for a couple of reasons, right? There's no feed. There are no ads. There's no data collection because it's end-to-end encrypted, right? Put it this way. Let's say I put you in a time machine and sent you back to the 1750s and asked you to explain our modern smartphone era to the person of average intelligence in the 1750s. Now, if I send you back to the 1950s, you can make some analogy to like radio, TV, whatever, right? But 1750s, pre-industrial, no notion of electronics or anything, right? How would you explain it? You would have to resort to witchcraft. You'd have to say, in the future, we have this magic amulet. And just believe me, how it works is you can transmit your thoughts to any human on the planet and any group of humans that want to listen to you. And you can listen to the thoughts of any human on the planet, which if you think about it, the fact that we've virtualized identities with this thing, again, I'm waving the phone, right? That we've all melded our brains to it, that like the input devices have become so seamless that effectively I can do it even faster than I can talk, right? Usually that's effectively what it is, right? At heart, right? And so, I mean, obviously we've seen WhatsApp implied in the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, in real life mob violence in India and a bunch of other nastiness, right? And so in some sense, like you can already get to the problems that we're all talking about with social media without the feed, without ads, without data, without any of the sort of nasty boogeyman that the New York Times keeps on harping about Facebook. Like we can still get there without any of that crap, right? And so it somehow seems to me the challenges around this technology really revolve around humans coming to terms with this like supernatural power that we've all gifted basically everyone on the planet who can afford $30 for like an entry level Android phone, right?
I mean, there's an interesting discussion that goes on, right? You hear people say, well, the problem is media literacy, right? We just need people to be more literate around their media. And there's some indication that the olds share more fake news and the young share less. I don't know. I mean, I think that's possibly true. I'm undecided. But my gut is that it's not correct. My gut is that, and I wish this weren't true, right? I'd prefer less paternalistic solutions. But my sense is that if we got that all right, we'd still have a big problem. But if you get the benevolent aggregator right, because we have aggregators, that's undisputable. The question is whether they're benevolent or not, right? If you get that right, you potentially solve the problem. So I believe I'd read WhatsApp is thinking about ways of limiting how fake news spreads, right?
Right. Yeah, that was as of this week. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting idea, and a positive move from Facebook.
So for those listeners who aren't familiar, I think it's worth stopping here for a second. The news for this week is that I think they're either expanding it worldwide or where they have made that limitation, they're making it permanent. But the key thing is that in markets like Brazil and India, they basically reduce the number of times you can forward a message or the size of the group you can form to something like 5 or 20 from either essentially unlimited or like well above, Dunbar's number of people. So it used to be like 280 or something or 240, I think. And now it's like 5 or 20. So like the limitation is basically dumbing down your magical little, clairvoyant, amulet such that you can only talk to 5 people at once effectively.
We're introducing friction. I mean,
right. Yeah.
These are low-cost transactions to spam fake news, and it turns out fake news is a lot more engaging than people like sugar more than vegetables, right? We live in an era where, our body wants sugar, and in nature that's fine, and in non-nature we eat Snickers.
But is that always true? Here's another angle on the same problem, right? Like, I'm not convinced that the sort of world of Cronkite and three networks, and for those too young to even know who Cronkite was, okay, back in the day, back in the battle days, before even me, okay, there was this one guy who basically told America the news, and then he used to close his broadcast, which was every day at 8 or 9 or whatever on the one of three channels, and he would say, and that's the way it was. He would literally close every transmission saying that, and he could unironically say that, like all Americans would nod their head and say, yep, that's the way it was, because good old Walt said it, right? And like, just to give a pepper with a bit of history, I think either LBJ or Nixon said, like, Cronkite came out against the Vietnam War, and he basically said, that's it. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. Right.
McCarthy came out against Nixon. He was known as the most trusted man in America.
Right, exactly.
So maybe that's not the world, maybe that's not the world we want to live in, but
that's the thing. I think when Cronkite, bless his heart, but I'm sure he got it wrong a lot of the time. And we all went along with the wrong Cronkite version, and we just never understood how wrong he got it, because there was no one there with a smartphone recording it saying, actually, it looked like this happened.
I think it's totally right. I think the flip side of that is I'm sure he worried about getting it wrong quite a bit, right? It's this sort of the Peter Parker with great power comes great responsibility. I think that's what's missing. You have, Mark Zuckerberg has more power than Walter Cronkite ever did, but I presume doesn't stay up late worried about it. I mean, maybe does, but I don't know.
Yes. I think the difference. And it's funny, Jill Lepore has a great piece in, I think it was The New Yorker, about like the whole history of journalism, where it's going. Can journalism pay for itself? Another piece of news this week is that BuzzFeed announced a bunch of layoffs, right? And this is shocking for those who don't follow the journalist thing too closely, because in some sense, they were considered to be in the vanguard of digital media,
BuzzFeed
right?
Was the future.
Yeah, I mean, I was not particularly surprised. I mean, I think to talk about media for a second, these are broad publications that are cranking out, by and large, BuzzFeed actually does some high quality reporting, I think, but in the context of this broader thing where no one would ever subscribe to BuzzFeed, but we're happy to give the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Economist our money, that's a model that works, right? There are thriving journalistic models. And I think an interesting thing about the modern media landscape is there's never been a time where there's more high quality journalism. It's just like finding it as a needle in a haystack problem, right? So we're overwhelmed with crap. We just have a curation problem, and you can curate that by just saying, look, I'm going to outsource that to New York Times and pay and read them, or the other places that I go that aggregate media could provide some of that to me for free.
Right. Well, or I swipe through Twitter and then I see like the hottest takes that typically are.
How do investigative journalists, et cetera, make money?
Right.
Is it Ben Thompson for everything?
Right. Well, that's
a slightly different model, right?
Right. Subscription. That's what.
Well, sure, subscription, but he's targeting a particular niche technologist. Yeah. That model works phenomenally well, but so does the New York Times.
Yeah.
Well, but I think so getting back to the Cronkite question, like, I think a lot of people are getting very cynical about the media precisely because we are seeing these other stories emerging.
Yeah, I guess I tend to think there's an interesting dynamic in the media, right? Is first of all, we use the word media and we don't delineate between media and journalism. I think that's actually an interesting distinction, right? So when you make that distinction, I think what you find is that if you're in the media and not a journalist, you have a strong incentive to foment distrust in the media where we use media to describe journalists, right? So in other words, if you're Fox News, actually the more people distrust media, the better it is for you because you're creating propaganda, right? And distrust drives your core audience that you're monetizing closer to you, right? So I actually think broadly a way that we should talk about media is to make this distinction and educate the public on what this concept of journalism is. So, I was somewhat dismissive of this idea of media literacy, but I think meta-media literacy is really interesting. So let's think about what the process of journalism is so that you as a reader can go out and assess for yourself whether the media that you're consuming is journalism or something that doesn't quite meet those standards. That's slightly different from saying, like, how do I think about reading a piece to assess whether it's got bias in it, for example.
Yeah, it still seems odd to me that we're in this weird place that, on the one hand, again, you can literally get live streaming video of whatever the event in question is, and yet that actually creates more doubt rather than less, right? One thought experiment, we ended up killing the column because I took too long to write it. But like in the Kavanaugh hearing, just to trip over the third rail yet again, right? Like everyone saw it happening basically in real time, or the Catholic student kid, right? Like imagine that media became even more intense. Like imagine there was like a VR camera there and you had VR headsets and you could like literally, like you could actually feel like Kavanaugh nervously drumming on the tabletop or whatever, or you could like see the kid with a smirk like in the actual event or whatever. Would that make your conclusions as to what you saw more sort of fair-minded and real, or would it actually be more polarizing and kind of distorting in a way?
I think context matters. So I'm thinking about the picture that turned the Vietnam War, right? The napalm covered child, right? Yeah. Just like, okay, well, there's the image, but the image is taken in context. And I think that's true of all of these media things, right? The reason you and I might have had very different perceptions of the Kavanaugh hearings is not because we all watched the same video and had more visceral reactions to than if we might have all read it in the paper 30 years ago. It was that the pre-roll for you was Tucker Carlson and for me was Rachel Maddow or something, right? Like there's this context, so you're primed to perceive the same video or the same VR or the same image in different ways, right? And it's that priming, I think, that really creates the...
Right, but the weird thing is that they all had the same video. And again, because of the context thing you just mentioned, we end up with like a more polarized view of it than when we had less data to go on, right? That's the weird thing, right? As we get to more and more data and see it like as real as almost being there, we actually end up more polarized rather than less.
Do you know what the data look like on this? Because you say this and it intuitively feels correct, right? It feels correct that, things used to be better.
I don't know about better. I don't know if lack of polarization is consensus is necessarily a good thing, but I definitely think it's more polarized.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I've seen some data on political polarization, but it's not obvious to me, right? And you hear occasionally, oh, it used to be worse. We were talking about the Revolutionary War and so on, the nasty things people did and said and so on. So it'd be interesting to try to quantify that. And I don't have that data.
The other media theorist you mentioned, Neil Postman, wrote Amusing Ourselves.
Oh, that's a great book. Yeah.
So why was that so prescient?
So it's funny. I did a column on exactly that. For those who haven't read it, so Neil Postman was a really interesting media commenter sort of dude, and he's definitely worth reading. They reissued it 25 years later. It's a classic. And I think why it's such a classic to him, again, as with McLuhan, the hot new media that was disrupting everything was TV or network TV, right? Like, which now sounds ancient, but at one point, TV was a big deal. I think it was prescient because he saw, and I'm kind of conflating him with another great book, which is also Daniel Boorstin's The Image, which is very similar. And they're both like, look at this new electronic media and you're taking, politicians, you're making them go from statesman to showman, effectively, right? I mean, there's classic example, obviously, is things like the Nixon-Kennedy debate, in which Nixon looked horrible and sallow and kind of grumpy.
Well, he didn't put on makeup, right?
Right. He didn't put on makeup. He put on lazy shave rather than shave, so he looked all kind of sallow. JFK was great, and all of America swiped right on JFK and swiped left on Nixon, effectively, right? To use a gender analogy.
In fact, actually, when they polled people afterwards, I think this is really interesting. People who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon had won the debate. People who watched it on TV thought Kennedy.
Right, and that's the jump right there from what, right. In 1942, he would have won, but in 1960, he did not. So yeah, Postman looks at that switch of like, what does it take to win, given every media at the time? So if you look at somebody, just to totally throw another monkey wrench into this whole thing, AOC, right? Like, I think she's a genius of marketing. I've her political views are a different thing, but in Wired, I've said I think she's a genius of marketing. And I think she's definitely the beginning of a new wave, that her Instagram account is like the debate moment for like social media, I think. And I contrast, but that's always been true. You go back to the Lincoln Douglas debates. That was the biggest media phenomenon of the time. They used the Telegraph to get the speeches all over the United States. Lincoln actually lost that race, but he was actually nominated for president 2 or 3 years later. He went from a nothing provincial politician to president of the United States based on a series of open air lectures that we now commemorate with.
Is AOC closer to Lincoln or closer to Kim Kardashian?
Well, I don't know. It's a bit of both, I guess. I mean, it's the point is that she's mastering the medium that molds a certain person, right? We're never going to have a William Howard Taft, a bald man who weighs 360 pounds anymore. It's just not going to happen to be president, right? So,
or an FDR who was in a wheelchair and no one knew.
Right. That's the thing. Right. Most America didn't know that. And that just wouldn't be the case now. I mean, I guess the other question is like, is more truth necessarily better? I just read this great book. Actually, I had dinner with him 2 days ago. So it's a guy named Martin Gurry. He wrote a book called Revolt of the Public. It actually came out from Strike Press, published right here in San Francisco. And he's a former CIA analyst who was their media analyst for global media. And he just thinks that what a lot of this media is doing is undermining the influence or the confidence that we have in a lot of these post-World War II mass market institutions like the New York Times or big government or whatever, and that it's impossible for them, or the police, for example, like with body cams and videos, we just don't trust the police like we used to. In fact, almost every societal institution other than the military has had a degradation in confidence by most polls, right? And I think it's just, yeah, when there's cameras everywhere and everything can be spun, no one can believe in anything, right? And
yeah, I think it also has to do with the business model around these things. Again, you know, if it is profitable to sow distrust in, you know, it's always been the case that attacking the incumbent politicians is a politically profitable activity. And so you've always seen it, right? It has become very profitable to attack journalists if you are not good at journalism. It's become profitable to attack these other institutions in, you know, multiple ways. If that weren't the case, you would see less of it, right?
Do we need to reform information markets in some way?
I think an interesting thing here is as we talk about the media environment, something I think makes no sense at all that is a common proposal is we just need to regulate these institutions, right? And as bad as it is today, the only way to make it worse would be to say, let's put the government in charge of telling Mark Zuckerberg what should be in the feed, right? That would be the one way.
Because that would just solidify that power.
So, you know, as I talk about this stuff and write about this stuff, I actually think that we need to acknowledge the fact that there are gatekeepers, and we need to develop a set of ethical norms and institutions that are widely held within technology, because let's concede that, you know, the technologists are the gatekeepers, that look roughly parallel to the ethics and norms in journalism, right? And you can go and you can look them up. They're enumerated. All journalists can tell you broadly, right, like what journalism is and what it isn't. People get fired, right? And so if it were the case that the average Facebook employee thought through the lens of an ethical framework that looked similar to the way that an average reporter thought, we build much different technical systems. The world will work much differently. The thing that you experience when you open up Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp or whatever it is would put different information in front of your face, and probably it would be better for you and for society, right? So I tend to think that the conversation we should be having is one around self-regulation and thinking deeply about, you know, the ethics of technology development. Some people are talking about this, but I think broadly we're having a different conversation, right?
I mean, making a call for civic virtue is great. Like, I'm all for civic virtue, but it just seems to completely unrestrain the capitalist enterprise these days. And the second thing I would say is, as a former Facebook employee, they weren't totally ethicsless. They weren't like sociopathic mercenaries. They had a very particular corporate culture and a particular vision for the world. It's just completely at odds with what the rest of the world thinks, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm critical of Facebook in certain ways, critical of Twitter in certain ways. I don't go so far as to say they're, you know, immoral bastards, you know. I tend to think more, I tend to characterize them more often as amoral, right? It's sort of like, here's a set of problems that you just wish wouldn't exist. You know, debatable whether that makes you evil or not, right? Just plugging your ears and going la, 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 la. But nonetheless, they need to move on these things, right? They need to be thinking deeply about these things. I think actually contrasting Twitter and Facebook is interesting, because I think Twitter is actually engaged a bit more with their set of problems, which overlap but are in some regard distinct from Facebook's. So there's a lot you can say that's negative about Twitter, but I think they've said, all right, how are we going to encourage or afford, like in user experience, you'd say afford, right? Like, what are the affordances of our product? Does it make it easier to argue with people? Does it make it harder to argue with people? And I think they've made some steps that are interesting along the way, and beyond that, signal that they're trying.
Yeah. But what if users revolt? What if users want that stuff? It's like the WhatsApp thing of like limiting the forwarding feature. Like, if that really is the value add of that, then some less scrupulous company will come along and take those users.
I guess I'm an optimist in the sense that I think this is a question of time horizon. I think on a long enough time horizon, interests converge, right? The interests of society, the interests of the individual.
You're such an optimist.
I am. So look, the classic joke on Twitter is like, I hate this thing, right? Like, I hate it, but I can't quit. It's like cigarettes, right? That's not good. You know, that's not good for Twitter. It's not good for Facebook when you're like, this is a product that makes me hate my cousins, right? It would be better if all the dopamine that I got from these products was maybe less in degree on a daily basis, but positive rather than negative, right? So I think the long term, and this is the irony of sort of the nouveau corporate structure where you've got the Zuckerberg who controls the whole damn thing, is he should be able to think on a 20 or 30 year time horizon. Right. And that would shape the product in a way that would be better for society, better for the user, better for Facebook. I'm in the camp that believes that these companies are not limited by short-term greed or profit motives, although it's not binary. I just think they're not doing it, and they could be doing it.
That's definitely true. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, short-term revenue was never really a factor at Facebook.
I mean, to give you a concrete example, when we sort of talk about the political landscape, right? When you see Ted Cruz in Senate hearings talking about, like, we need to go regulate Facebook. Fake news, and there's data on this, right, is much more prevalent in the quote-unquote conservative segment of society, right? It's just a fact of data. When Facebook makes it easier to spread fake news, right? It makes it easier for this segment that supports Ted Cruz to believe that Facebook is against them, right? This is a unvirtuous cycle, right? So it is in Facebook's best interest to take the short-term hit of actually doing something to regulate fake news internally, which would be just a shitstorm, right? Short-term. But I think that there's a long-term scenario here where this stuff just goes on long enough that it becomes politically viable for a conservative coalition to do some stuff that's really not in Facebook's best interest as a corporation. So I think we are aligned as a society, as a set of corporations, as individuals. We want to be happier. Facebook wants to make more money. We'd all like democracy to thrive. And the real bottleneck is these gatekeepers owning that responsibility.
Antonio, where do you differ from Parker in terms of proposals or solutions? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know that I accept Facebook or Twitter's gatekeeper status, right? Like taking the crown of media intermediation from the editor-in-chief of the New York Times and putting it on Zuck's head instead. I don't know if that's really the solution. Like they don't want the crown. Like they
have it. Well, they have 1 billion users. They have 1 billion users.
Right, but they don't want to exercise that power. Like they don't want the job.
They have it. They make the feed. You look at the feed. They censor something like 70 or 80% of all of the content that you
censor is a strong word. They downrank and feed.
Sure. I'm being provocative with the term, but the way that I think about censorship, right? Because we have this broad conversation about censorship. I'd be interested in your perspective on it. People will say this thing: I don't want Facebook to decide what I see. I don't want them to censor my feed. And the reality is they are showing you a small percentage of the units of content that they could be showing you based on what your friends and family are sharing, because you just don't have enough time to read it all, right? So we have to start with the fact that Facebook already decides which subset of the information you could see, you do see. And so, okay, so I call that censorship. You can call it whatever, filtering, whatever you want, right? So great. We all agree that Facebook is deciding what you see. The real debate we should be having is, are they doing a good job of it, right? Are they picking the subset that is best for you, best for society, and best for their business? I would submit that they're not. I think they would say, gosh, we just don't want to think about that problem because it opens up a can of worms that makes us really uncomfortable. And I'd say, well, tough shit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic debate here is the difference between the editorship and an algorithm, right? Like at core, that's what it is. Because what you're saying is, and again, it's not censorship. Censorship implies that the person who wants to get their message out wants it to get out, and you're thwarting that, right? In this
Everybody
case,
wants their message to get out. I want my message to get out.
But it's one thing to say, I don't think you should say what you're saying, versus, you know what, our model says like what you're saying is frankly not very interesting, so we're not going to show it to Uncle Joe.
I think that's an issue of semantics. I mean, look, the editor of the paper says you get to publish, and I don't get to write opinion pieces in the New York Times. I would write lovely pieces in the New York Times. I'm such a smart guy. My opinions are so good. They won't let me. Right, they're censoring me.
But the difference is that the editor says, eat your veggies. We think you should read this because whatever. Our education says that this is a good opinion to read. And what Facebook says is, well, we're showing you shit that you've engaged with.
I mean, I think
that's a very different decision.
Where I would push back in a strong way, because I think you're saying something that is a common refrain is, you're saying algorithms aren't people. And I just think that's bullshit. People write the algorithms, right? People are making decisions. They may understand those decisions in an indirect way, or they may not understand exactly what the outcome is going to be precisely, right? They don't pick the discrete articles, right? But we can actually look back in retrospect at the outcome and say, well, okay, well, here was the result of the algorithm that you designed. You're the editor. You wrote code to do your job for you. Here was the outcome of it. Let's collect data on that and decide whether we think that outcome is good. Are you a good editor based on this data? So we should be having a conversation around, are these algorithms resulting in things that are, again, good for the business?
Right. But that training set that you just described at the end of the day can only be things that you do on Facebook, right? It's literally engagement or time on Facebook, or at the end of the day, it's Facebook usage of some sort. That's the only signal they have. To deviate from that script, they'd have to say, you know what? This would actually get more usage. But even if this gets less of a readership, I mean, this is basically what editorship is. Like, we're not going to publish if it bleeds, it leads, clickbait, whatever. We're going to talk about the war in Yemen, which at the end of the day, not that many people actually want to read about in a deep way versus whatever the Kardashians did. They're saying, eat your veggies, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying, that's it. Abandon the algo and, impose this whatever.
I guess I would say, to sort of add a layer of nuance here, that when I think about this stuff, I actually don't think this is a broad problem. I think if you just said, look, like, the way you need to think about this Facebook is with respect to a narrow set of issues, I think particularly around politics and democracy, right? I don't think that publishing a bunch of, fake news about Kim Kardashian, or just a bunch of news about fake Kardashian, I don't actually think that's bad for the world, Like, if you read a bunch of stuff about about Kim Kardashian and that's all you read and you're a quote unquote low information voter, it's probably actually not that bad a thing. Right? Where you
as long as you don't go vote. Yeah.
Well, no, you can, look, we've survived hundreds of years with low information voters, right? It's not the case that people are less informed today than they were hundreds of years ago, across the bell curve of informativeness. It's what happens in this narrow segment, right, around politics and democracy, where I think we need to think really hard about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think politics is definitely different. I think, different standards should apply to political ads and all the rest of it. I don't know if it's a fundamentally different problem. No, but I still think that's the fundamental duality. It's like, you're basically training on some success metric, engagement, usage, whatever, or you're imposing some view that is, I think you should be reading this.
I think there's something in between that, right? There's the editor sitting in a room, the philosopher king sort of deciding, right? There's we only look at dashboards and data and optimize for those. There's stuff in between. You can go talk to your users. I'm sure Facebook does this to some extent. You go out and you have a focus group and people say, I feel like crap at the end of the day. I keep clicking. I can't not click. Great. You're selling cigarettes. Let's get into a different business, right? Let's think about how to build a more sustainable business. So I think you can collect other kinds of data than clicks, and you don't have to be on the other side of the spectrum either, right? We can go out and we can think deeply about these problems and use some combination of qualitative data, philosophy, whatever.
I've got it. You put a plug into your phone that you then inject into a vein, and it measures your cortisol levels. And then based on your cortisol levels, Facebook then feeds you different pieces of content. That would totally work.
Yeah.
I'm sure people will, as soon as they get the portal out there, we're going to have the Facebook IV
this is the
that you just plug in.
Facebook Neuralink. We'll get there.
Oh, yeah.
Antonio, if Zuck comes to you, or not to make it Facebook specific, if Jack Dorsey comes to you, one of those, and says, hey, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to do.
Oh, my God.
That'll make the world a better place. What do you tell him, Zuck, or Jack?
A better place.
Or the place you want to live in, maybe.
I don't know. Give away most of your money? I don't know. That's fine.
As it relates to the media problem, the problems that they're facing.
I really do think it's a cultural problem and it's a generational problem, right? I think, Steve Jobs once famously said, I think the original version of the Mac shipped with a keyboard, which people thought would be a problem, and because no one knew how to touch type. And he said, well, death will take care of that problem, right? All the old people who didn't know how to type, it's like, well, and all the old people who don't know how to tell truth from falsehood because they're used to Cronkite telling them, and this is the way it is. Well, that won't be a problem in 20 years. It's funny, you call it media literacy. It might just be media cynicism, right? Like, again, to take the grand media theorist look on things, look back at every piece of media. The first film that was shown in Paris, I think it was the Lumiere brothers, was the famous story, was a train pulling into a station. And everyone was so freaked out because they had never seen a image. They jumped out of their chairs thinking they're about to get run over, right? Or consider radio, right? Which the fascists in Europe convinced educated populaces to invade their neighbors and exterminate ethnic minorities. And now NPR has to beg you to give them $50 for a tote bag, right? Like it loses the effect. The magic is gone. TV I find boring as hell. I could not possibly watch some of the 80s TV that Neil Postman was talking about and amusing yourself to death. You couldn't pay me to watch that crap anymore.
Oh man, you got to go back and watch some Alf. It's amazing.
And actually, I think I used the example of Alf in my column. As I believe it or not, like an alien that shows up and lives with a suburban family used to be like the most highly rated show in the United States.
How do you fix Twitter? I mean, it depends what problem you're talking about when you talk about fixing Twitter, right? Or you talk, because I sort of think about these social products as a pipeline, if you will, right? So you've got these Reddit groups where there's like these fringe people hanging out, coming up with ideas, right? They're surfacing these ideas. They get popularized on Twitter. That actually pushes them into the cable ecosystem, right? Sort of a little bit more traditional, non-journalistic ecosystem. And then they get pushed into Facebook from there, right? Yeah. So I think, to me, when you think about this problem of fake news, right, where the biggest broken thing with Twitter is trending topics, right? Something trends, that makes it a valid thing, right? It makes it the topic of the day. And then we all talk about it. We all write articles about it, right? So sort of abuse and some of these other problems with Twitter aside, I think actually fixing the way that Twitter trends works is their version of the Facebook feed curation thing, because it is the case. Like, I look at the 2016 election, right? What I think conservatives did really well, or bots, or whoever it was, right? A set of related groups. We just say, like, look, here's going to be the topic of the day, right? We're going to talk about this email thing today, this, that, the other. Those things trend, and then they're on the news, and they're in Facebook, and they're everywhere else. So I think Twitter's version of solving this problem is figuring out how to responsibly set the agenda, because I think Twitter does set the agenda.
Right.
So you believe in the editor. You're saying you want an editor.
I think you do this with code, right? You can do these things with code. I'm not a believer that we have to choose between automated algorithms that are going to be chaos and a human sitting there, philosopher king, deciding what these things should be. I think we need to write algorithms and then reflect on how they're doing, look at the outcomes, look at the results, and say, does this make sense, right? Are we creating, from a business perspective, are we creating an experience that is good for our business and good for our customer? Ideally also good for society. But how are we doing? What is the result? Does it make sense? I think Twitter is doing a pretty good job. I think they are not perfect. They're getting a lot of crap. I think a lot of that is a function of mistakes they've made in the past, right? Jack Dorsey no longer gets the benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's fair. But I think they're trying, and they're not doing a great job yet. Hopefully they will going forward.
So here's a simple thesis. I want you guys to react to it. It's a generalization that in sort of the late 2000s, the rise of technology sort of coincided with, or was synergistic with sort of left and democratic ideas, sort of the Arab Spring, sort of the rise of Obama, supported leftist institutions. And then at some point that started to shift, where they started to become a threat to those same institutions, a threat to what are the traditional left institutions, universities, New York Times, journalists, Hollywood. And that is why, and then tech over time became an enemy of the left because it threatened the government, threatened the very institutions of which the left has thrived. How would you respond? Is that accurate? Is that directionally accurate?
Oh, I think so. I mean, Rico just published they did sentiment analysis over the New York Times coverage of Facebook over time, over the past, whatever, how many number of years. And you just see like the phase transition in, something weird happened in November 2016. I can't remember what, where suddenly it goes blue positive and just goes instantly to negative and just has stayed negative basically for the past 2 years.
I think you've got to look back a little bit further. So I think an interesting thing about modern culture is, we talk about sort of, they often say liberals have won the culture and conservatives have won politically, right? I think if you look at the mid-90s, something weird happened, or the early 90s, which is Bill Clinton showed up and he's like, actually, I'm a capitalist. Capitalism is good. It's cool. Let's go do this new Democrat thing, right? I actually think 92 is an inflection point in American society that we don't appreciate enough, because once the Democrats started being capitalist, right? I think that Republicans lost a core issue, right? It's like, well, how are we defined? I think going back a little bit further, you had coming from the left this concept of postmodernism, right?
Yeah.
I think actually if you look at the modern Republican Party, a good way to think about it is it's adopted the principles of postmodernism, right? So you end up with a party where the ends justify the means and we lack the substantive issue of the economy.
And is that your description of postmodernism?
I think it's an aspect of postmodernism, right? Moral relativism. So I think when you think about moral relativism, if you are a moral relativist, you can justify a lot of actions by the outcome. And I think that that's what you see in conservative media today. So I think Fox News and the conservative media landscape has adopted this moral relativism, right? And that's carried forward into digital media, right? So digital media is just an extension of cable news, right? Which is sort of the original, like, well, you can have an infinite number of channels. Everybody can have their own thing. So Obama, in my mind, is more of an exception to that trend, right? Like, great, he got good at communications in this digital media world and won. Not by a lot, but he won. Got a couple terms, right? So this trend that started in the early 90s follows through to today, right? You can sort of follow this trend line through to today. And Obama is an exception as opposed to the heart of the trend where now we're sort of seeing a reaction to that or a difference, if that makes sense.
You sent me this chart over text where Silicon Valley is versus the rest of the world. Unpack that chart a little bit.
Yeah, so this chart looks at the political divide in a slightly different way and says, look, you can imagine a 4-quadrant chart where one axis is market orientation, right? Free market, closed market. And the other axis is whether you're pro or anti-welfare state. So do you like Social Security? Do you like these sorts of things? Do you dislike it? Are you pro-market, anti-market? And I think what's interesting about this chart is it doesn't quite map to the way that we talk about politics today. But it maps really well, actually, to the way Silicon Valley sits, right? Which is, I think Silicon Valley is very different than the rest of the country, not generally in the ways that we talk about it, right? So Ted Cruz might say Silicon Valley is very liberal, right? But that doesn't quite capture it. So what you have in Silicon Valley is everybody's free market, right? We all love capitalism, free markets, right? Which isn't per se a liberal thing.
Right.
Half of us love the welfare state and half of us think it's horrible, right? So you have Peter Thiels of the world, the Keith Boys of the world, who would sort of be in that upper left quadrant. You know, we love the markets. We dislike all these social services. Then you have other folks, maybe the Reid Hoffmans of the world, maybe other folks say, hey, look, we love free markets. These things are great, but we're actually pretty comfortable with government. We're pretty comfortable with a social safety net, so on and so forth. So I think that's actually a good frame for thinking about the ideological differences and spectrum in Silicon Valley. And actually probably a much better way we should probably apply that frame more broadly to American political discourse to think about what are the parties. My personal belief is that the parties are realigning, and what we're going to see is a party that is kind of in that free market welfare state quadrant, and one that's much more populist and ambivalent or anti-market. I think Trump is the prototype of that. Let's have some tariffs. Let's put up some walls. We haven't quite seen where the Democratic Party is going in America. My hope would be that it moves more towards that pro-market.
Could AOC, right now she seems more, I guess, more in the Trump camp, but could she embrace the free market plus social services, or would that just be too hard to explain to her people?
I mean, I think
her base. Personally,
it doesn't seem that way to me. I think you got to reserve judgment on these people. What do we know about Beto? What do we know about AOC? We don't know much. They're good at the internet, you know? So I like to reserve judgment. I'm not a champion or a critic. I mean, I think the reason I'm particularly default skeptical on her is when she talks about many of these issues, she tends to express what I perceive as a zero-sum mentality, which is, I think, what puts you in that anti-market camp, right? So I tend to be a little bit default skeptical, not when she talks about, marginal tax rates. You can have high marginal tax rates and be a capitalist, right? But when you talk about income inequality, for example, as a first-order issue, and you talk about billionaires being thieves and whatever, the problem is not rich people being rich, it's poor people being poor, right? And that's where I think there's an opportunity for some more interesting voices in our particular political. This is a very American-centric conversation, and we could be talking about how these social trends affect other countries and so forth. But I think with respect to America, that's an interesting way of thinking about, where politics are and maybe where the gap is.
Totally. Antonio, is your writing on secular religions about things like SoulCycle? Is it about things like how Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins themselves are more Christian or religious than they think? Or
all that and more?
Yeah.
I'm doing a piece on secular religions for a couple reasons. I mean, one of the things that in my grand thesis that the internet is bringing back a lot of our pre-literate stuff is that I think religions are coming back in a big way. Whenever I say that, people express skepticism, mostly because I think most people don't understand religion. There's not a lot. So I was raised Catholic and I went to a Jesuit school, and I know a lot about the Bible because we were forced to read it, and I now read it for other reasons. But religion isn't really about deities, right? They say, I don't believe in God. How can I be religious? Religion is about interpreting reality via, myth, ritual, and folklore, right? Versus data, experimentation, and rationalism of the Enlightenment. That's the big split.
Or narrative framework is how I think about it. You create a narrative framework and that shapes your worldview.
As one example, Buddhism and Confucian ancestor worship have no gods, and yet you would not call them religions. They're obviously religions, but they're centered around a certain myth and rite. And in fact, again, I think this is one of the big advantages, I think, of having been raised religious is just understanding the religious mentality in others and seeing it for what it is. Because I think it's just very difficult for someone not raised in a religion or who's taken it as a serious subject of intellectual inquiry to reason about it, because they get sucked into the same Harris debate, and I think they just get lost in it. Let me just sketch out one concept where I think people's religious education, I think, would give them more insight. So inside religion, there's a notion of orthodoxic versus orthopraxic religions. And I can get into what an orthodoxic religion is like Christianity, right? There's this confessed belief that there's this man named Jesus Christ who was the son of the living God who was reincarnated. And it's a sort of reboot of first century Judaism that, I would say Christianity is Judaism with product market fit, right? Effectively, that they figured out the exact, key features to steal basically from Judaism to make it go viral for two millennia, basically, right? And that's in some sense what it is, right? But that's one type of religiosity. Like people who were born again, who Christ is their savior. It's this very confessional mode, right? But then you have what are called orthopraxic religions that are centered less about, like in English, right? Faith is almost synonymous with religion. It's a weird artifact, right? In religions like, I would argue Judaism to a certain extent, or Hinduism, right? Religion is defined by practice. It's what you do, right? It's actually going to temple. It's being part of a community. It's actually embracing concrete values that you were effectively born into. These tend to be religions that also don't proselytize, right? They don't knock on your door and try to convince you to become a Hindu or...
Their viral coefficients sucks.
Right. Right. I mean, Yahweh just doesn't have a good enough growth team, but Jesus does, right? The growth team just sucks, right? While, obviously the Mormons or the Seventh-day Adventists, they're all about it, right? They've got, Chamath over there running the growth team, and they just spam you with emails like crazy, just like Facebook, right? And so, I mean, that's the big difference, right? And so the weird thing about Christianity is that orthodoxic feature that we believe. And then the thing is, if you're in an orthodoxic faith, thinking correctly, heresy, apostasy are real deep sins, right? Believing the wrong way or abandoning a faith that you professed in is a big deal, right? If you actually talk to a Hindu about their Hinduism, they're a lot more casual about it, right? I mean, people don't get excommunicated, and, it's a very different sort of attitude towards religion. And then the other thing that I think the key thing people don't understand about religion, because again, it became such a part of the Western mentality that people don't even see it anymore in that sort of fish and water way, is this notion of millenarianism, right? The Christians and the Jews to a certain extent were waiting for a Messiah who's going to change and fix everything, right? And, the early Christians, to them, it wasn't some sort of abstract thing, right? They really thought that Christ was going to be resurrected in their lifetimes, right? At Pentecost, they were taken by the Holy Spirit, and all these Pentecostal evangelicals now who speak in tongues and all this stuff are basically emulating the apostles, right? But how Christianity survived, right? Because again, it was a cult, and there were many mystery cults at the time, is by saying, well, look, that paradise we promised you in this world? Actually, sorry, rain check, you get in the next, right? And it turns out offering, paradises in the next life are, rather easier settlement terms than paradises in this term. And so it sort of survived, right? But the problem is that, secular manifestations of this religious impulse, millenarianism, have to produce it in real life, right? Like communism, which I would argue was a secular religion, right? Had to produce that the triumph of the working class in real life. And when it didn't, it could only last so long, right? You could say the same thing about fascism, other versions of it, right? And so, I think one of the interesting things about current life is that a lot of the social justice crusaders and a lot of the progressive wing of the United States don't even understand that in many ways they're the heirs of deep evangelical Christianity in the late 19th and early 20th century. If you look at like what were called the Great Awakenings, right, in American life, it's these surges of religious thought and moments of political crisis. And we've had so many historians disagree about how many there are, whether there's 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. But it was precisely during these moments that things like the women's suffrage movement started right around the same time as, I think, the Third Great Awakening, or the temperance movement started around the same time. A lot of the abolitionists were militant Christians. The Underground Railway was partially managed by Quakers. Like, a lot of the religious crusading evangelical spirit used to be where social justice emerged in this country. Those were the movements. But at some point, that whole social justice thing became a little bit too much for the evangelicals. They abandoned that and became the conservatives. And now instead we have the SJWs, or whatever you want to call them, right? So it's intriguing that we have, again, these these recurrences of this notion of creating paradise on earth, but through some sort of savior figure and attacking any heresy that goes against it. And again, we're so used to that we don't understand that in most cultures, this doesn't happen, right? Like,
yeah. Have you read this Jim Gray book yet?
Yeah.
Broadly.
The 7 Types of Atheism?
Yeah.
That's a great book. Yeah. This is, I think it's called The 7 Types of Atheism, right? I think it's John Gray, if I'm not mistaken.
John Gray. Yeah.
It's really good. I mean, I think he's a former academic philosopher, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the first 4 types I understood. The last couple, he kind of lost me because they got a little too subtle. But.
I haven't read it yet, but the interesting idea, I've listened to a couple interviews with the guy. The interesting idea to me was he effectively says, look, like a lot of these secular movements today are really just Christian movements in disguise, right?
Oh, yeah,
like
of course.
They've accepted the basic premise, specifically around progress, right?
Right.
So if you think about social justice, the premise is, look, we can make the world better, right? We just need to do these things and then we'll all move forward. And Sam Harris, it's science, right? And so I think that is a super interesting and provocative idea. I think he's quite pessimistic around progress.
As am I, by the way. But
yeah, well, to me, the interesting walkaway was to say, okay, well, if we all worship something, gosh, I should really think hard about what my thing is.
That's my key point in writing this thing. So, like, at the end of the day, the religious impulse in humans, I think, is just unsuppressible. And it's like sexuality, right? If you either try to ban it or pretend it's not there, it's just going to raise its ugly head in like the most weird or perverse or destructive form. And you just like, just reconcile yourself to the fact that you're going to have weird, completely unempirical metaphysical beliefs about things. And you should just be very careful about the things you choose to believe in because, it's just amazing that everyone claims to be like this physical empiricist, but like, tell me, where do human rights exist under a microscope? Where can I see that? Right. Mm-hmm. Or, why do you care about your FICO score? That's like the most made up crappy thing. Like even money. Why is money a thing? Right. Like that doesn't mean anything. There's no reason why that exists. You believe in all sorts of metaphysical concepts that have nothing to do with anything. Right. Why are you even making fun of the Holy Spirit? Right. And you're sitting there worrying about your FICO score. Right. But that's the thing. It's like basically what set of metaphysical concepts do I choose to pay attention to and raise your life around?
Well, and how do you use them for good? Because they are good, right? And this is sort of the premise of Sapiens, right? It's like, we create these narrative structures and they allow us to grow societies beyond Dunbar's number. Right. That's a pretty cool thing. Right. So how do we use these for good? Even when we're talking about religion, many good things that it's done.
Right. I mean, there are some positive externalities around religion that, beyond the Sistine Chapel, for example, that, that aren't necessarily worth, that are worth keeping around. And then, and part of the reason why I had this is like, I think as you do, I had young kids now, right? And it's like, all these things are basically like freshman dorm bullshit sessions late in the night until you have kids. And then suddenly you're playing with like real money on the table. It's like, oh shit, what do I teach the kid about the world and raise them and values? And like suddenly patterning the next generation's brain is like a real responsibility. And so like part of what my thinking about religion is like what religion to raise this kid in.
So your next book can be the Brian Kaplan book on why you have no impact on raising your child, which I don't particularly buy all of it, but it's, if you want a free pass, go read. There's a set of literature out there around why you don't matter.
I think the liberal blank slateist belief that anyone might have just runs up against the rocks of reality when you have kids. And you realize that in fact, that kid is just like a little mini caricature of you. And there really isn't much. Even at the age of 2 or 3, I can already see my own features coming out in this kid as well as the mother of the kid. And it's like, I'm not going to change this.
Will new religions be winner take all or will it be a long tail of niche winners? And
so it's 2 things I would say here. One, because there's a VC in the room. One is, I just read a piece, it came out in the Bold Italic, about there actually are like these nouveau religions in the Bay Area. One I think is called Thrive. I don't want to plug them because I don't know that much about them, but there's like, it's kind of like the Unitarians who are basically like a God without a God, and they get together and like play the drum and have the whole community thing around no God. Like, and I'm a little skeptical if that can actually last, but I think it's interesting. And the second thing is I heard
sounds like a lifestyle religion to me, not going to be.
Yeah. I'd never heard of a lifestyle religion, like lifestyle startup. It's like not quite as serious as like a lifestyle religion. That's fun. The second thing I heard is it was a podcast by, now I forget, it was either Priceonomics or maybe This American Life or whatever. One of my top 3 or 4 podcasts in which, in the evangelical world, they evidently actually do have religious startups. Like when you go to one of these, sort of Bible beatery, sort of, I was raised Catholic. To me, they're all heretics, but one of these subsets of Protestantism, I can't remember which one.
That's what they say about you too.
Yeah, I'm sure. You can actually go and pitch like church VCs who will then bankroll in like a progressive, like Series A, B, like type situation, your neighbor, and they actually follow to entrepreneurs. There's no other word for it.
I think they actually talk about it as seeding churches.
Yeah, right, seeding, exactly. That's what it is. They call it seeding churches.
They're like the Match.com, of which there's like a Tinder, there's like a Bumble, there's all these different flavors that can emerge.
So Parker, maybe you should fund like
bad
a church.
metaphor.
Yeah, well, it's a good business model and tax advantageous as well.
That's as it turns out. Yeah.
Hard to get your money out though.
I was wondering, what's the liquidity event there exactly?
Maybe tithing.
In the life after, and you get paid later. That's the thing. Again, millenarianism. That's how it works.
It's not good for your IRR. I need better timelines. Look, I mean, I think tying it back to media, I always thought there could never be another Beatles, right? That came along when there were 3 channels, and there was X radio stations, and that made them. I mean, they were phenomenal, right? You got to have the raw material, but it's the biggest band in the world, partially because of the media environment that they just happened to time, right? We are probably never going to live in a media environment that looks like that. So you would probably by default think there's going to be more fragmentation, but there is this deep underlying need for community, right? So everybody worships something, be that your church, be that your community where we all get around and bang on our drums, whatever it is, right? So you should expect to see that need for community met somewhere, somehow. And some people will do it better and they'll aggregate more people, and some people will do it worse. I mean, look, I've never been to one of these. I'd love to go to a mega church.
Yep.
Right? Like it's like a stadium and they got basketball courts and it's a community, and I've read a little bit about how they work. It's just fascinating, right? It seems as much around community with like a religious veneer on it than it is around, religion. It's a pretty interesting phenomenon, right? There's a deep need there for something, and it's being delivered by this organization.
I mean, that's the thing to me. Like, again, thinking about raising the kid religious, it's like there needs to be a third, like that kid needs to understand that humans can get together and create community around common values that doesn't involve either like consumption or sports, right? Which those are basically the only other 2 alternatives in our weird neo-capitalist like thing is like, that's like, what else is there? Like Starbucks, rose to billions by being the 3rd place outside of like work and home. That's it. Like our social fabric is so tattered. There's no other place to go. You just sit there and buy a latte.
I tend to think about, just to, rat hole on Starbucks for a second. I'll give you my favorite theory about business, which is if you can figure out how to make a dessert, socially acceptable at a time of day where otherwise wouldn't be, you can make $1 billion. That's Starbucks. It's a milkshake for breakfast. That's all it is. They sell milkshakes for breakfast. They made it socially acceptable. You can walk in and have a milkshake for breakfast and look your coworkers in the eye when you walk in the door. That is, I don't know what their market cap is, but it's a genius idea. Just go do that.
I definitely agree on the milkshake thing because I made another market observation. So speaking of Alameda, because we both partially live in Alameda, there's a Starbucks on the western end of Alameda right before the tunnel that I used to go to because whatever, it's the closest cafe there. And what I discovered is this weird market inversion. I used to do the Starbucks mobile app, which is pretty good, right? Because like I hate waiting and I hate talking to humans because like everyone else, I'm kind of introverted. And so but then what I turned out is like ordering on the app is actually slower than just waiting in line and ordering because so many people had actually piled into the mobile thing. And I think queuing is part of the problem. I always get dark roast, grande, that's it, done. Like the simplest damn thing to make. And I'm always queued behind 10 people having the like pumpkin spice, frappuccino, soy, I don't know what the hell it is. It's like this tall.
50 grams of sugar.
Right. 50. It looks like it's 3,000 calories and it evidently takes, 5 minutes to make and there's 10 of them ahead of me. And then I'm stuck there. But you're right. I'm on the milkshake front. I don't understand. Yeah, they definitely, it's like alcohol with airports. You can drink it any time. Like there's part of the joy of it is like all the rules are suspended in airports. Like you can do anything. You can sleep on the floor. You can order a beer at 9 a.m. Like it doesn't matter. Like rules, like that's what I think. Maybe that's another idea. Like the airport concept, but just somewhere else.
Drinking at breakfast. That is a pretty good idea if you could sell that.
Yeah. On that note, guys, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
All right. Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.